Hi, everybody. Welcome, all the dear students. Welcome to MediMagic Live webinar on this beautiful Sunday noon. My name is Ishita, and I'm the brand manager of MediMagic. So, as most of you must already know, we are India's most loved medical education app, and we have very highly engaging 3D videos, which helps you master all the difficult concepts very easily. So, all of you who doesn't know about the app yet, they can download it via Play Store and App Store. So, as you know, in today's session, you will learn to master the key concepts in cardiology and will be understanding how to rapidly diagnose ACS and provide expected emergency response. So, without wasting any further more time, I would like to introduce Dr. Tare, our guest speaker. We are very pleased to have you on board, sir.
Thank you.
It'll be great if you could turn on your camera, please. Great, great, great. Good afternoon, sir. How are you doing?
I am fine. Thank you very much.
Perfect, perfect. So I'll let you to the session now. I'll leave you with the students. It'll be great if you could start the introduction and then we can take it forward.
Thank you. I am a professor of, I'm an honorary professor of family medicine currently in St. John's, but my whole career has been in the Department of Internal Medicine at St. John's Medical College Hospital. I have a wide experience of practicing in cardiology, pulmonary medicine, and my interests include medical education, ethics, bioethics, and care for dying people. These are the three areas in which I have special interest. So, without wasting anything, I'll just recap what we learned in the last session. So last session we discussed about the case of a Mr. NS, now who was 45-year-old, who had come to the emergency room with a acute onset of chest discomfort, which was unrelenting and led to a lot of discomfort to the patient, and he was brought into the emergency medicine. So we discussed why the physician thought that this pain could represent a acute coronary syndrome and what is the basis or anatomic basis of this particular assumption that this could be a acute coronary syndrome. We also discussed the pathogenesis of acute coronary syndrome. We discussed key concepts in coronary circulation, the anatomy, the flow in the coronary arteries, the physiology of circulation, and we also discussed what damages the coronary arteries, namely the atherosclerosis. We discussed about the pathophysiology of atherosclerosis, the risk factors leading to the development of atherosclerosis, and also discussed some of the pathological concepts of myocardial infarction, ischemia, demand and supply, and the impact of autonomic nervous system on oxygen demand of the myocardium. So all these concepts we reviewed to a certain extent, but the real difficulty starts when you are in front of a patient and now you are trying to figure out what to do next. Most of the young doctors who are in the emergency room panic no at this situation where a person presents with chest pain and you are suspecting myocardial infarction and get into a little confusion as to what is the next step. So, without going into panic, you have to understand that infarction is an acute process, and as there is an infarction surrounding the infarction, there could be area which may not be dead as yet, but ischemic. That area can be salvaged, and for salvaging that area, it is important for us to do a early diagnosis. So most often, no, we'll get a phone call from an intern or a resident who is in the emergency room. Sir, this patient has come with a chest discomfort. What should I do next? No. So we tell them that an urgent diagnosis is necessary, and the basis of an urgent diagnosis of an acute coronary syndrome is an abnormal ECG and an elevated cardiac biomarker. Shortly, we'll come to what is meant by cardiac biomarkers. But you know very well that if you have a chest discomfort, all you want is do an ECG. Let me check out if I have got a cardiac problem or not. And most of the patients will come demanding no, an ECG should be done. There is a wide awareness about the value of ECG in evaluation of an acute chest pain. So this is what I showed you even last time, that this is a normal cardiac action potential. You know from your physiology that there is a resting membrane potential which is negative because of a constant, uh, exit of sodium from the membrane. So as there is a electrical stimulation to the myocardial cell, sodium leaks leading to a positive action potential at a threshold. And after that, this process is called as depolarization. A depolarization is followed by repolarization, during which gradually calcium and potassium currents flow, and they cause a return to the what is called the resting action potential. Now, if you sum all the action potentials of individual myocardial cells and record it on the surface of the chest wall, you will get something like this. This is called as a what is called as a cardiac complex, no, electrical complex. There are five waves here: P, Q. P is a positive waves. It represents the atrial depolarization. The upstroke represents the depolarization. The downstroke represents the repolarization. And then there is a large R wave, which represents the depolarization of the ventricular muscle. And then there is a T wave, which represents the repolarization of the ventricular muscle. So this is how a complex looks on the surface electrocardiograms. Although there are multiple leads in which this is recorded, each lead of the ECG is directed towards one surface of the myocardium, like the lateral lead, anterior lead, inferior lead, and so on and so forth, which gives you an idea up to which part of the heart is getting affected. Now, if you know, if there is a myocardial injury, the membrane is the first thing to suffer. And when the membrane suffers, there is a leakage of ions from the intracellular compartment to the extracellular compartment. This constant leakage which goes on is referred to as the current of injury. And this is what leads to changes in the surface activity of the electric cardiac action potential, which is referred to as the changes in the ST segment. Now, in the normal ECG, you might have noticed here that between the S wave and the T wave, there is a horizontal line. This line is called as ST segment. And when there is a current of injury happening, this either will deflect down or it will deflect up, depending on the degree of ischemia. If there is a complete positive injury current, no, then the ST segment will depress, while if there is a negative injury current, the ST segment will elevate. And these things tell you that there is a injury current ongoing, and this injury current is what leads to a diagnosis of a myocardial infarction. So it is important to visualize this concept that an electrocardiogram is summation of all the action potentials on the surface of the chest wall. One, two, whenever there is an injury to the myocardium, there is an abnormal current which is called as current of injury, and it doesn't occur only during the activation of the myocardium, but it is constantly present. And that is what is reflected on the surface electrocardiogram, and that tells us that there is something ischemic going on within the myocardium. So you can see in this particular picture that this is the normal ECG. As you can see, the red area represents the subendocardium of the heart, and below the subendocardium there is the overlapping, or on the top of it is the normal myocardium, and therefore you find that the ST segment deflects downwards now. While when there is a full thickness myocardial infarction, the ST segment gets elevated because there is no viable myocardium between the two. So you can differentiate between a partial thickness infarction and a complete thickness infarction by this particular aspect, whether the ST segment is down or the ST segment is up. You can see in this electrocardiogram, look at this ST segment in the normal electrocardiogram by the side, and you can see in the ECG strip which has been shown how the ST segments have elevated, and this elevation is what represents the acute myocardial infarction. The second thing which you look at, the diagnostic technique, is the biomarkers. Now, biomarkers are enzymes or proteins which are released into the blood circulation because of a damage to the myocardium. As you know, troponin is an important component of skeletal as well as cardiac muscle. It is not present in the smooth muscle. It is present only in the cardiac and skeletal muscle. So whenever there is a necrosis of the skeletal or cardiac muscle, you get this release of troponins. The cardiac troponins are two. One is called as troponin I, the other one is called as troponin T. Now, if you look at the microscopic structure of the cardiac filament, you will find that there are elements of actin and tropomyosin, and the troponins bridge across them. and they help in producing the contraction of the cardiac muscle. So when there is a damage to the cardiac muscle, these get released into the circulation and get elevated. Within the first 2 to 4 hours, you will find that cardiac troponins will get elevated. The other biomarker is called as a creatinine phosphokinase. Now there are three isoforms. Creatinine phosphokinase is an enzyme which is present in many tissues in the body, but their isometric structure is different, in different tissues. So in brain, it is called as creatinine phosphokinase BB. In skeletal muscles or myocardium, it is called as MB, while in the skeletal muscle, it is called as MM. So the techniques which I have for measuring creatinine phosphokinase quite refined. So you can get the myocardial component of this enzyme very easily in the laboratory. Fast tests are available. They are called as stat labs. You get the results within 5 to 10 minutes. Of processing the sample, and creatinine phosphokinase gets elevated relatively later. It will take about 6 hours or 8 hours before the creatinine phosphokinase starts getting elevated. So many times when you find that these, supposing if a patient comes with chest pain to you in the emergency and the pain has started barely 30 minutes back, many times you may find that these biomarkers are normal, in which case it becomes difficult to decide whether a necrosis has actually happened or not. So it is quite advisable not to wait for 4 hours and repeat the enzyme test if there is any doubt about the diagnosis or establishing a definitive diagnosis, particularly if the ECG features are not very classic in nature. So these two put together, the ECG abnormalities and the biomarkers which are elevated, makes you or enables you to make a pretty fast diagnosis whether an acute myocardial infarction is happening or not. There is a poll. I think I will give it 30 seconds. All right. So we will proceed further.
4% have
Now,
said true. So I hope that's the correct answer, sir.
yeah.
Great.
So now the next question after the diagnosis established is, most of the residents will call the consultant and ask, no, this is an emergency situation. Shall I shift the patient to the coronary care unit immediately, or is there anything I need to do in the emergency? No. So, transportation of a patient from an emergency department to a ward or a coronary care unit is a time consuming process. Many times it may take as long as 30 minutes, 40 minutes, unless beds are available, not available, all these issues are there. So therefore they want to know what is to be done immediately, so that there is no further progression. So there is something which we call as immediate treatment once a diagnosis is established. So the most immediate treatment is, of course, relieve pain. Uncontrolled pain is not. I mean, if you have, any one of you has suffered from an acute pain, you know the degree of distress which it can produce. It produces a lot of anxiety. It produces tachycardia. It activates your sympathetic system, and as you know, sympathetic system activation leads to an increase in metabolic rate. When there is an increased metabolic rate, it demands more from the heart, and as a result of which there is an increased myocardial demand. That is the last thing which we want when the myocardium is getting damaged as a result of ischemia. So relief of pain is an important priority in managing these patients. And we don't depend on ordinary analgesics to produce this. We use very strong analgesics, which not only help in relieving the pain, but also to a certain extent blocking the sympathetic activation. So what are the immediate steps? So the immediate step is, first thing which you use is use of a narcotic like a morphine. Morphine is commonly available in all emergency medicine departments, and one can use morphine to relieve the pain immediately. Next, oxygen. Although many of these patients may not have low oxygen levels if their heart is functioning normally, but it is better to assume that these patients are not receiving enough oxygen, and if we can increase somehow the level of oxyhemoglobin in the blood, at least the myocardium will not suffer on this count. So till such time the patient gets shifted out of the emergency room and is under cardiac monitoring, it is better to put all these patients on oxygen with a mask. The third thing which can relieve the pain is by improving the blood flow to the ischemic myocardium. So for that, a drug is used, which is called as nitroglycerin. You might have heard of this very commonly used drug. Many even lay public is aware of what is nitroglycerin. It is commonly called by its short form NTG, and the function of this drug is to cause vasodilation, and particularly effective in vasodilation of the coronary circulation. So when a vasodilation happens, it expands the diameter of the coronary artery, and therefore it improves the blood flow to the myocardium. So these three constitute important first, or let me say, first aid kind of to patients. Even when medics are transferring patients from their home to the hospital, these three techniques are quite commonly used. The other two drugs which are used for specific purposes is to block the sympathetic system. Beta blockers, that the sympathetic system exerts its effects through release of catecholamines, and catecholamines effect on two types of receptors, one alpha receptors and one beta receptors. And you know that beta receptors are of two types, beta 1 and beta 2. Now the beta 2 are the ones which are concentrated on the myocardium and the heart. They produce stimulation of beta receptors in the heart, produces two effects. One is it increases the rate of firing of the sinoatrial node and thereby the heart rate. And the second, it increases the contractility of the myocardium. So one is called the chronotropic effect, which increases the rate. The other one is called the ionotropic effect, which increases the contractility. Now both these are responsible for an increase in myocardial oxygen consumption. So you block the beta receptors of the myocardium and you'll find that the heart rate will drop, the contractility of the myocardium will be negative, or what we call the negative inotropic effect. Both of these will lead to reduction in the oxygen requirement of the myocardium, and a decreased oxygen requirement will reduce the degree of pain which the patient is having. The second drug which is commonly involved, again, both these drugs can be used in an emergency while the patient is being transported to the hospital from home, provided their blood pressure is normal. Is the second drug is the aspirin. Now you know that body produces a vast types of prostaglandins, and these prostaglandins are produced by the metabolism of arachidonic acid, which is present in the cell membranes, the phospholipid layer of the cell membranes. Arachidonic acid is first broken down by an enzyme called as cyclooxygenase. In platelets, particularly, there is another enzyme within the platelets which is called as thromboxane A2. Now, this thromboxane A2 breaks it down further to produce what is called as a thromboxane A2. Sorry, the name of the enzyme is thromboxane synthetase, and the product is thromboxane A2. Now, once the thromboxane A2 is activated, it leads to aggregation of platelets and adhesion of the platelets. So normally when there is any break in the endocardium or a clot is forming in the coronary circulation, platelets get activated through this mechanism, and they cause adhesion and formation of a white thrombus. To prevent the formation of this type of a thrombus, you use aspirin in low doses. Now, aspirin blocks the thromboxane synthetase and it prevents aggregation of the platelets, and therefore it prevents expansion of the clot.
Okay, so we were just going through this, and as we've clearly expressed, the drugs and dosages, these are the goals of management in anything, as Dr. Tari has explained so well. So, Dr. Tari, could you take it forward and explain to us just how we can, what are the dosages that we need to give of these different things in order to satisfy the relieving pain, the clot expansion, clot reduction, and the decrease in oxygen demand that we are trying to manage?
Yeah, well, there are, in the emergency room, the dosages are very standard. As you can see in this slide, that morphine is used in two. See, use of morphine is meant primarily to relieve the pain. So till a pain is relieved, now you can use small doses of morphine every 5 minutes till the patient says that his pain is better or is under control now. So usually use 2 to 3 milligrams of morphine intravenous as a bolus dose, not in the form of an infusion or dilated or diluted with saline, but as a bolus dose. So you can go up to 10 milligrams of morphine within half an hour time to relieve the pain. The second drug which is used to produce vasodilation, like I explained, is the sublingual nitroglycerin. Nitroglycerin is very well absorbed from under the tongue, so you have to keep the tablet under the tongue. It gets absorbed quickly and it produces really vasodilatation. You can use this dose twice, every 5 minutes apart till the pain is relieved. Because if beyond three doses, patients develop tolerance to its effects, so there is no point in continuing with the dosage. So up to three doses, this is quite adequate. The metoprolol, which is a beta blocker, is used intravenously, although more widely used metoprolol is oral, but specifically for this emergency, metoprolol is used as an intravenous preparation and it is used in the doses of 2 to 5 milligrams every 5 minutes with a maximum dose of up to 50 milligrams. Now the target is reduction in heart rate. So as long as the heart rate continues to be above 70 or 80, you continue giving metoprolol till the heart rate drops below 70. Once a bradycardia develops, then we know that we have an inadequate beta blockade. Aspirin is given in a dose of 150 to 125 milligrams, and it is given as a single dose stat. No, it is not repeated. While oxygen is delivered at a rate of 2 to 4 liters per minute. You can monitor a saturation of the oxygen by putting a pulse oximeter, and by that you can calculate the dose of oxygen. Majority of the patients, unless they are in severe documentation emergency, their oxygen saturation is usually good, and oxygen is given only during transportation to the
Okay. Going forward, we have a couple of polls here. So we're going to stay on this and just check to see how much you've remembered of the previous two conversation. After all, this is the most important part, which is the emergency management of ACS. So we're going to give two polls for this. Please give in your answers and we'll head further. Dr. Tariq, could you take it forward? No, it's okay. I think they'll manage to answer these polls while they're free. And we can just talk about what is, so I think what the question is that we've given people this medication, right? They've got the treatment. Are they better now? Is this complete?
I think this is just the emergency management, as you can make out, that this doesn't solve the problem completely. And now the goals of treatment, which are immediate goals of treatment, is salvage the myocardium, which is still viable, and limit the infarct size, save what you can. Second is immediate resumption of coronary circulation. That is what will achieve the first objective. Third is removal of clot or obstruction in the coronary arteries, which will again, achieve the first two objectives, and restoring circulation distal to the site of blood. Basically, it boils down to one single objective, and that is restoring circulation in the coronary artery which is affected. This is called as revascularization. If you are able to revascularize the affected coronary artery, blood flow to the damaged myocardium or the myocardium which is at peril will be restored, and probably will be able to see or save the myocardium. So, how can we go about it? How can the circulation be restored? I mean, the objectives are very clear. So, how do you go about it? How do you restore the circulation? So, there are three strategies in this. First strategy is thrombolysis, very commonly used, particularly in coronary care units. We do not have an advanced cardiology department. Wherever there is a catheterization laboratory, or what is commonly referred to as cath lab, available in the coronary care units, you keep an option of performing a percutaneous transluminal coronary angioplasty. We'll come to it in a little while. And the third option is what is called as a bypass. Put a graft from the arteries before the obstruction to the artery distal to the obstruction, or from the aorta to the artery distal to the site of obstruction, and that way you'll be able to restore circulation. Now, this bypass graft, what is commonly referred to as CABG, is used only very select patients. It is not used very commonly. So let us come back to the first option, and that is the one of thrombolysis. Now, you know, the body has got a balance between the coagulation and the resolution of coagulation. The system in the body which removes the clots which are formed as a result of daily wear and tear in the arteries, where small clots form and they are resolved, is called as the fibrinolytic system. Now, fibrinolytic system works by activation of plasminogen. The plasminogen gets activated by certain factors called as TAFI and TAF1 gets activated, and the activated one which converts plasminogen to plasmin. And plasmin is what lyses the clot and leads to release of what are called as fibrin degradation products. So this system, which lyses the clot, has been used to dissolve the clot within the system. So there are three types of mechanisms or methods which are used to use the system. One is the heparin, which is an anticoagulant. So heparin activates a particular factor in the blood circulation called as antithrombin 3. Now antithrombin 3 acts at multiple levels of the coagulation cascade, but its main effect is on conversion of prothrombin to thrombin, and it prevents that conversion. And that's why it is called as antithrombin 3, so that it prevents extension of the clot, but it cannot dissolve the clot. It is an anticoagulant, it can prevent the extension of the clot only. For dissolving the clot, you need and so there are these two enzymes which are called as streptokinase, which was first isolated from Streptococcus hemolyticus, and the second, which is called as the urokinase. These two enzymes are able to lyse the clot directly without involving the fibrinolytic system. So they directly lyse the clot by their enzymatic action. The third mechanism, which is called as a tissue plasminogen activator, it's a biologically produced molecule, and it causes activation of the plasmin and uses the natural flow of stimulating the formation of plasmin and thereby dissolving the clot. So you have got three things here. As you can see, heparin, which prevents extension of the clot, streptokinase, urokinase, which lyses the clot, and the TPA or tissue plasminogen activator, which uses the fibrinolytic system to lyse the clot. Now, out of these three things, the most
So,
popular one is still the tissue plasminogen activator. Any question?
just to clarify, so you're saying that there are three different types of treatments: anticoagulants, which is used by heparin, which prevents the further extension and worsening of the clot; streptokinase, urokinase, which is the only thing that breaks down the clot directly; and the TPA, tissue plasminogen activator, which is something that activates the body's own systems which act against the clot and can both also break down the clot. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is true.
Okay.
And the most effective is still the tissue plasminogen activator as compared to streptokinase and urokinase, although it is expensive.
Right, right. Obviously, this has to be created, this thing. And can we move on to PTCA and stenting?
Yeah, now this shows to you the concept of what is called as a balloon angioplasty. So a catheter is inserted into the artery. Usually the catheter is inserted through the brachial artery, and it approaches the heart. It reaches one of the coronary cusps of the aortic valve, and from there it is introduced into the coronary arteries, depending on whether the right coronary is affected or the left coronary is affected. Once you reach the site of obstruction, then you inflate the balloon. Inflation of the balloon opens up the artery, and the circulation removes the clot. Next to do is, for many patients, the obstruction in the artery is so localized and so small that it is sufficient to use a balloon to expand the artery and expand its lumen and restore the circulation. But many times when the length of the obstruction is larger, then a spring, like which is called as a stent, it is made of metal and certain bioprosthetics, which is inserted into the obstructed artery, which expands and keeps the artery expanded. This is particularly true in arteries which tend to collapse after the balloon angioplasty has been done. That is when the stents are introduced.
So
as you
this
can see here,
balloon is on a catheter that is
balloon is on a
entered into a person's artery from their which artery, sir?
It is usually introduced through the brachial artery, but many
Okay.
times even femoral artery is used to access the aorta.
So the artery from their arm or their leg, which is for the first year students here, and it's introduced through that, it goes all the way to the aorta, which is the main vessel of the body where the heart blood is pumping up, and from where the coronary circulation starts, the blood vessels going to the heart come from. And
Yeah.
from there, we expand it until this entire coronary circulation is getting relieved of the stenosis, the
Correct. So you
constriction
should be able
caused
to
by this.
identify the what is called a coronary cusp of the aortic valve, because the coronary arteries or ostia lie in the coronary cusp. So you have to introduce this involves a lot of technical expertise, to be able
Yeah.
to introduce that catheter into the coronary ostia and into the coronary artery.
And also some specialized equipment, right, sir?
Yeah, and you need what is called a cine angiography, to visualize. Now I've shown you two images here which show what happens with an angioplasty. Here, left-sided panel, you can see one of the coronary arteries. This is the anterior descending branch of the left main coronary artery, which you can see is completely obstructed. But you can see down in the bottom panel that the artery is getting filled. That shows the concept of a what we call as a collateral circulation through the collaterals. You can even see the collaterals, small blood vessels, which are linking from the site of the block to the distal part. Once the angioplasty is done, you can see this restoration being circulation being restored, and the artery is getting filled throughout its entire length. That is a very long segment which is getting blocked. While in the second panel, you can see the first one, which is showing an occlusion just before the branching of the artery. And post angioplasty, you can see that that occluded segment just prior to the branching is getting filled up with the dye. So once you do an angioplasty, you have to do a angiogram again, to see that whatever you have done has restored the circulation actively.
Yeah. So what you're showing here, sir, is that if you look at the A part, so it's like a before and after, and before there is no circulation, and post that the entire blood vessel can be seen much more openly. And this is a contrast CT, correct, sir?
It is a contrast. They use a contrast in
Contrast, and they're seeing the blood vessels of the heart through that, and they're able to open it up. Now, sir, the last time I think is the CABG, or the coronary artery bypass
So
grafting.
the coronary artery bypass graft surgery is rarely required in patients with acute, unless they are in cardiogenic shock or salvageable or serious complications exist, where an angioplasty is not possible. Here the patients are taken up for coronary artery bypass graft surgery. Very select patients are taken up for this technique, and there are two techniques. As you can see, there is one red graft which is coming from the aorta to the anterior descending artery, and this graft is an arterial graft. The artery is taken from the behind the sternum, which is called as an internal mammary artery or internal thoracic artery, and that artery is cut, a segment of it is taken, and it is inserted between the aortic arch and the coronary artery. The other technique, which is more widely used, is called as a saphenous venous graft, where segments of saphenous vein from the leg are taken and they are inserted from the root of the aorta to the obstructed vein distal to the site of obstruction. Now, this is a very special technique. You need to put the patient on a bypass, which means that the heart becomes inactivated for a certain period of time till this grafting is done. Nowadays, the techniques are so advanced now that they do it on beating hearts also. These grafts are put on hearts while they are beating. It is called the beating heart surgery. So many times heart need not be paralyzed for these procedures. If heart needs to be paralyzed for these procedures, then you have to put the patient on an artificial heart lung machine, which is commonly referred to as the bypass.
Okay. So, sir, I'm just going to drop a poll about which artery is the arterial graft going to. You've already mentioned this, but let's just see how many of them remember what you said and are able to identify it based on your last lecture or their own studies. Which artery is the arterial graft going to? Please take a look, everyone. Take a moment to just answer it as well as you could. The arterial graft was going to a very specific artery. Okay, it seems like many of them are getting this right, so the LAD. And so we shall move on. So you've talked about these things. So there's clearly like If there's a cath lab, I can take them for PTCA. If there's a surgical, if I have a CTVS surgeon, a cardiothoracic surgeon, I can move them in for a CABG operation. And if they have none of these things, if I at least have the medicine for streptokinase or urokinase, that works too. If I don't have any of these, I'm in an urgent situation. Is there any conservative management that I can apply?
Well, that's a little difficult question to answer because nowadays I do not know how many of the students are willing to work in
Rural
situations
areas,
where facilities are not available. A lot of
right?
students are motivated to work in these settings where facilities are not available. They would still like to do best as much as they can. Second thing is that many times patients are not in a position to be able to undertake a journey to a place where this is available, and time may be lost, or they may not
Exactly.
be willing to do it for various reasons. So in such a situation, I mean, there is very little you can do except prevent the extension of the clot and use medical methods, for reducing the oxygen demand of the heart and enhancing blood supply conservatively through medicines.
So,
So in such
would
a
conservative
situation,
management? Yes, sir.
usually heparin is the drug which is used for first 48 hours, and quite often it is extended to a period of up to 5 days, particularly if the patient is faring better, So like I mentioned previously, antithrombin 3 is activated by heparin, which is prevents the formation of thrombin from prothrombin, and thereby it also blocks conversion of fibrinogen to fibrin, and so therefore the clots do not get extended. So it is expected that the uh, clot will not expand, and the further myocardial compromise will not happen if you use heparin. Now, two types of heparin are there. One is called as unfractionated heparin, which has to be administered every 6 hours, or it can be given as an infusion also. And the second one is called as a low molecular weight heparin, which is more widely used nowadays, which has to be given subcutaneously twice a day. Now, unfractionated heparin causes prolongation of one particular parameter of the coagulation system, which is called as activated partial thromboplastin time. So you have to monitor the effect of heparin with frequent checking of this particular blood test, which is called as activated partial thromboplastin time, or APTT, as it is commonly referred to as. And you have to have a therapeutic effect. While with low molecular weight heparins, it can be seen that you don't need to do any blood test to monitor. They are usually effective. That's why they are more preferred.
So, if we go ahead and going to drop one last poll to see if they remembered what the conservative management of ACS is. And I think we've got slightly less time, so we're going to rush through the next part in a little bit faster, but I'm not going to ask you to drop it. It seems that nobody, okay, they're responding to the poll now. And many of them seem to have remembered that the conservative management of ACS is indeed LMWH, though a few people believed it was TPA, streptokinase, and PTCA. So we're going to move on, sir. So the patient is transferred to the CCU, and here they're experiencing like intermittent palpitations and episodes of breathlessness. Now, sir, these are just symptoms, right? I mean, we've treated the thing, we've done a definitive management of this patient, that they have got PTCA and everything. Are we still concerned about these palpitations and episodes of breathlessness when we've already made the treatment?
Yeah, complications can develop, particularly post revascularization. Rhythm disturbances are common as blood flow resumes to the ischemic myocardium. The myocardium is still unstable and it starts receiving its blood supply. So there is a phase, or let us say a time of instability, during which changes in the cardiac rhythm can occur. So they are very significant. Both of them are very significant. Palpitations indicate that there is some electrical instability, while breathlessness indicates that the pumping action of the heart is not adequate, or let us say it is failing, which is a sign of a failure. Now you can see here I am showing you the conduction system of the heart. There is a sinoatrial node, there is an atrioventricular node, and you can see the distal his bundle and all that thing. As the electrical impulse is conducted from the sinus node to the AV node and then to the through the his bundle and its branches to the rest of the myocardium, it produces a surface electrocardiogram which shows the P wave QRS complex. P wave QRS complex. P wave. This is called as a normal sinus rhythm, and this is what you see. The heart beats at a normal sinus rhythm. Although when the pulse is regular, we always say that the patient is in sinus rhythm. But if you need to confirm whether it is sinus rhythm or not, you need to record an ECG and demonstrate that there is a sequential activation of chambers, atrial activation by P wave followed by ventricular activation by Q wave. This is what is called as a sinus rhythm. Now, what happens? You see, either the heart can start beating very fast, which is called as a tachyarrhythmia. Now, here you can see a example of a tachyarrhythmia. Here the heart rate has gone up to almost 150, and you can see the complex, the QRS complex, what we call as the normal electrocardiograph complex, is not normal, it is widened. So this is a tachyarrhythmia. Now, tachyarrhythmia, which is commonly seen, I will just mention names. Probably it is too short a time for us to discuss about them. Tachyarrhythmia can affect either the atrium, which is called the atrial fibrillation, or it can affect the ventricle, which is called as a ventricular fibrillation or ventricular tachycardia. Atrial tachycardia or atrial fibrillation, ventricular tachycardia or ventricular fibrillation. Fibrillation is basically very fast beating of the concerned chamber. The rates in this situation can go as high as 400 to 600 per minute. The other is bradyarrhythmia. By bradyarrhythmia, we mean the heart is beating too slow. So now when each impulse from the atrium is not transmitted to the ventricle, we call this as a atrioventricular nodal block. And in this case, the ventricular rate declines. As you can see here, the rate is less than 50 per minute. It could be somewhere around 40 per minute. So either a tachyarrhythmia or bradyarrhythmia, both of them can impair the cardiac pump function and produce the second symptom which is there, and that is what is called as a. This is another picture which shows you the atrial fibrillation. You can see here that the atrium is the QRS complex is there, so it indicates that it is only the atrium which is beating very fast. The atrium is beating fast, but it is not as fast. In the second panel, you can see the rhythm is completely disorganized, and this is referred to as a ventricular fibrillation. Now, ventricular fibrillation is an emergency. It leads to what we refer to as a cardiac arrest. Most of the deaths due to acute myocardial infarction occur because of this particular arrhythmia, ventricular fibrillation. This is a very dangerous rhythm disturbance. Most of the patients who die on the road to the hospital die because of this rhythm disturbance.
So, sir, the reason for these rhythm disturbances is because the electrical discharge of the heart is not being accurately put to every single part. Some parts are not sort of depolarizing at the right time, and they repolarize randomly, and this causes a very strange rhythm. But when we see ventricular fibrillation, for example, the entire heart is contracting in a very ineffective manner.
Yeah, there is hardly, see, at a rate of 100, say somewhere around 400 per minute, the muscle layer will be almost like shivering. No, it will not be contracting effective. It will be just
Correct.
like shivering. So there is no effective cardiac output. So most of the
Right.
patients with ventricular fibrillation will not have a recordable pulse. They will not have a recordable blood pressure. They will not have an effective circulation. And unless some ultra fast actions are taken, patients may succumb to this particular complication.
So they actually are not having any cardiac output because of this fibrillation of the ventricle.
Yes, there is no cardiac
And
output.
so this is probably what leads to the breathlessness in the patient?
No, I mean breathlessness is a very probably atrial fibrillation will more commonly lead to breathlessness, not
Breathlessness.
this particular. This leads to death.
Right. This slide, sir. We were looking at what is the
So
cause
we'll
of breathlessness.
go on to the next slide, which is about the heart failure. Cardiac output
Uh-oh.
is dependent on two factors. One is the myocardial contractility, and the second one is the heart rate. The cardiac output which happens with each heartbeat is called as the stroke volume. While if you multiply the stroke volume by the heart rate, you get the cardiac output. That is per minute. Now, both rate as well as force of contraction or the contractility play important role in a cardiac output. Now, if this pumping action of the heart is impaired, now here the muscle is getting damaged. Now, the damaged muscle will not be able to produce sufficient force, no, to produce. Heart tries to compensate, but once the compensatory mechanisms have been overwhelmed, no, then the heart will not be able to put out the amount of blood which it receives. No, so the forward movement of the blood will be impaired, cardiac output will be reduced, and when the cardiac output is reduced, there is a backlog. Say supposing 100 ml is coming to the heart, and normally the heart gets out 90 ml. If it starts getting out only 70 ml, then there is a backlog. This backlog produces some effects which are backward and some effects which are forward. The backward effects are and backward, backup of blood in the lungs, which leads to pulmonary edema or exudation of fluid into the lung from the left ventricle to the left atrium to the pulmonary veins for the buildup of pressure, and fluid starts leaking into the lung as a result of elevated pressure. No, and this leakage of fluid into the lungs is what produces the feeling of breathlessness. This is quite an acute complication which develops in many patients, and the grade may vary from patient to patient. The other effect is forward, and that is when there is a reduction in cardiac output, there is a hypoperfusion. Hypoperfusion leads to fatigue, development of cyanosis, lower blood pressure, cool extremities, renal involvement, and sometimes when the perfusion is quite significantly affected, disorientation, because even blood flow to the brain will be affected. So you take into consideration this backward effects and forward effects, and that is what produces. So these need to be rectified, as early as possible. So what are the goals of management in the hospital? Now, once the patient has stabilized in the hospital post angioplasty or after thrombolysis with the streptokinase urokinase or TPA, whatever method you use, what are the goals of management next? So the first goal is reduce activation of the sympathetic system because it causes increase in myocardial oxygen consumption. Then there is a factor which we call as afterload, if you are aware of what is. The heart is always pumping against the peripheral vascular resistance. The pumping action of the heart is more effective if the peripheral vascular resistance is low, while the pumping action is impaired or heart has to work harder if the peripheral vascular resistance is high. The system which
So
contributes
to
to the peripheral
clarify, sir,
vascular
what we are
resistance.
trying to do here is reduce the work of the heart, to reduce the effort that the heart is putting in.
Yes.
And in doing so, it's a sort of like we're giving the heart a sort of break, a relaxation break, using some medicines to tell it to relax. In
So
the sense,
yes,
we reduce the
yes.
work, the sympathetic system reduction using metoprolol and all that is basically telling the heart itself to relax, and the reduction of activity through the RAAS system is telling the rest of the body, stop making so much work for the heart,
Yeah,
release your resistance to it, just let the blood come in, and don't make it a difficult thing for the heart to send blood to you. Is that sort of what we're trying to do?
yeah. So, the renin-angiotensin system works by producing angiotensin 2. And angiotensin 2 is a peripheral vasoconstrictor. It increases the peripheral vascular resistance. So, you are trying to break that. As you can see, renin is produced from the juxtaglomerular apparatus of the kidney. It reaches the lung where the angiotensin converting enzyme system cleaves it and leads to formation of angiotensin 2, and thereby increases the peripheral vascular resistance. Not only that, it also stimulates aldosterone secretion, and aldosterone secretion, as you know, causes sodium retention and thereby increases the circulating blood volume and further increases in the blood pressure. So both are blocked now if you block the renin-angio system, both aldosterone as well as angiotensin 2. So what you need to do is activate that angiotensin converting enzyme in the lung. You block that enzyme, and that's why the drugs commonly used are called as ACE inhibitors, or those which inhibit the angiotensin converting enzyme in the lungs. While the beta blockers which are used, I already explained previously as to what beta blockers exactly do through their negative inotropic and negative chronotropic activity. So, like let us look at the drugs which are prescribed now. Beta blocker, commonly metoprolol is used, although nowadays there are many beta blockers which are available. Metoprolol is still the most widely used drug. The dose is between 50 to 100 milligram per day. For an ACE inhibitor, we use a drug called lisinopril. The dose is anywhere between 5 to 10 milligrams once a day. So lowering cholesterol, use statins like atorvastatin, which is used in the acute emergency setting in a dose of 40 milligram once a day. However, if you are looking at a long-term management, after 4 to 6 weeks, you can reduce the dose. Then you have to continue anti-diabetic drugs like oral drugs or insulin. And lastly, use low-dose aspirin, 150 milligram once a day. Quite often it is combined with a drug called clopidogrel, which inhibit the adenosine. As you know, platelets are also activated by adenosine.
Hypertension is in Qatar.
Inhibition of adenosine will also be effective in reducing platelet adhesions and aggregation. So many times, cardiologists prefer to use a combination of both the drugs.
So I'm just going to say, can this patient go home safely? We have placed into effect these treatment methodologies that you mentioned here, right? And all these things are likely to take into account the goals of our management, which is reduce the work of the heart and to reduce the cholesterol and all the other things that have been making it worse, and to also manage things like diabetes and hypertension that have been leading to the atherosclerosis of these vessels. I think one thing that we haven't mentioned, sir, is the role of statins.
Statins are again no lowering of the LDL cholesterol, or what we call as the low density lipoprotein cholesterol, is effective in preventing the extension of atherosclerosis. But you have to
play a role in stabilizing the plaque.
Yeah. So what happens is statins, they have some anti-inflammatory effect. So when a atheromatous plaque becomes unstable, it releases certain cytokines which produce a local inflammation, and this local inflammation can be reduced by the use of a high dose statin. And when inflammation is reduced, the plaque becomes what we call as a stable plaque, less likely to rupture, less likely to further aggravate the situation. That's why in the initial phase, 4 to 6 weeks, statins are used in very high dosages, 4 times, 6 times the normal dose which is used in otherwise normal patients to reduce the cholesterol levels. We can go home safely. Nowadays, hardly any patients are kept beyond 1 week in a hospital post successful treatment of myocardial infarction, unless there is a complication. If there is no complications, patients go home by the end of week, usually within 5 days. Sometimes they may extend by a couple of days for observation. So secondary prevention, there is something we call as a primary prevention. If there is so much of education which goes on into controlling blood pressure, diabetes, cholesterol before the development of a coronary disease. So many people do it so that they do not develop a heart problem. That is called as a primary prevention. But once you have developed a heart problem related to these diseases, then whatever you do to reduce the recurrence of that problem or complication of that problem is called as a secondary prevention. So in secondary prevention, there is weight reduction. You have to achieve an ideal weight by diet control, graded exercises, stopping smoking, increasing your physical activity, leaving sedentary lifestyle, controlling blood pressure, controlling diabetes, controlling dyslipidemia. And the drugs which I mentioned are more or less same drugs which are given earlier, unless there are some additional problems which the patient has. But basically, the management is with beta blockers, ACE inhibitors, statins, aspirin, clopidogrel, and drugs for control of blood pressure and blood glucose.
Right. So we just have some videos. I just want to share with you that this is all something you can learn from our MediMagic app. Okay. We've put down, while we don't have the complete management, something like that, but we've got the physiological basis of all of these, from the heart's physiological anatomy, the ECGs, to how the renin-angiotensin system works in the juxtaglomerular apparatus of the kidney. Necrosis. Does necrosis occur when necrosis occurs to an M2 myocardial tissue? What actually is the reason that this necrosis remains? Does the necrosis die? Does the necrosis tissue die completely, or can it be reperfused? Can it be saved?
The myocardium which is salvageable, which is partly ischemic, which has not undergone an ischemic necrosis, that can be salvaged. But the
That can,
myocardium which has become necrosed is
yes,
replaced gradually by body's normal healing processes with fibrous tissue. Myocardium can never be recovered. Myocardium doesn't regenerate, it doesn't have the potential to regenerate. So whatever myocardium has died is replaced by fibrous tissue. And
yes,
fibrous tissue is non-contractile. So even in late in life, let us say 2 years, 3 years after the development of myocardial infarction, if you do proper studies like echocardiographic studies, you can still see the segment of the myocardium which necrosed no is
yeah,
not contracting. It doesn't
yeah.
move. It doesn't
And
move.
so there's another question that's very similar to this. So I'm just going to bring it up right here. Another student asked, why is there so little carcinoma of the heart? And I think what you said here about the lack of regeneration in the heart, the fact that the heart cannot and does not regenerate, is the answer to this question.
Yeah, possibly yes. I mean, there are very rare tumors. No, most of the tumors are what we call as endocardial tumors. No, which is but they are many times they are benign tumors. They are referred to as myxomas. They are
Yes.
myxomatous tumors. They originate from the connective tissue of the heart rather than from the myocardium.
Right.
Myocardium is seldom involved in
Mhm.
malignant processes, although many times malignancies from other sites, like for example, you take malignancy of the breast or malignancy of the lung, it can spread through bloodstream and get deposited in the
Get
heart, no,
deposited
which
in
we
the
call as
heart.
metastasis.
Right. And also through the heart go elsewhere.
Yeah.
So last thing I wanted to so just show a couple of videos on embolism and how this, I mean, we've started this process a while ago. We couldn't show it last time. I'm sorry, everyone. We're just going to show you a couple of videos on embolism, which you will find in the myocardial infarction video of MediMagic. So here's the video on the.
This results in release of thromboxane A2, 5-hydroxytryptamine, fibrinogen, platelet activating factor, adenosine diphosphate, which further promote platelet aggregation. Activation of clotting cascade leading to fibrin formation and propagation and stabilization of the occlusive thrombus. Platelets release thromboxane A2 and 5-hydroxytryptamine, which cause vasoconstriction and promote development of local vasospasm, which worsens coronary occlusion. This diminishes blood flow to a region of myocardium, causing ischemia. Platelet activating factor. This results in.
Okay, I can't really pause it midway. But the point is that every one of these functions, every one of these chemicals that we're talking about has now become something that we research, that we spend time in trying to utilize. So we use the knowledge of these factors to try to provide treatments that will attack these factors, change these factors, and prevent them from going forward and causing clots. And Dr. Tare has already described whether it was aspirin, clopidogrel, and we now have newer agents like the 10A inhibitors, like I think that was I can never pronounce these. Aprixaban, sir?
Yeah, but they are anticoagulants.
Yeah,
They are
yeah.
more
So
anticoagulants. They are used in select population of patients.
exactly. And these are all things that we can use to prevent coagulation, but I just want you to keep an eye on these because what I'm saying is that these factors here, the understanding you get from your physiological basis, your pathologies, these are really, really very important to understand how these medications are working, which one to use when. If you use two medicines that have the same mechanism of action, it's not going to improve that. Now, I'm just going to move ahead and show you that we've really found a great, improvement in people's understanding and conceptual understanding through these videos. It just helps you visualize it a bit better. And I hope that the pictures that we've used today help you understand what a coronary, these sound like they're very, very unusual, but these are all standard protocols of management. And being able to visualize it always helps you to, first of all, understand what's going on, but also to improve your understanding and your memorization of these things. Otherwise, it's very difficult to memorize or memorize anything that you don't completely understand. So it builds your conceptual understanding and builds your memory of this. And we hope that this will help you become better doctors, all of you, in the future. And we really appreciate all of you coming here today and joining us and listening to Dr. Tare give us this very brief but very extensive. I mean, we've had to shut it down and like sort of ask him to slow down on some things, but he's tried his best to convey to you just how to manage an issue of arterial blood supply in the heart, the biggest issue that we are facing today, and the biggest disease across the whole world right now, but especially in India right now. And finally, I'd just like to ask you to look at any of these plans that we have, which allow you to look at these videos. And I also want to thank Dr. Tare, who has taken time apart from, I mean, he's already practicing and everything, and he's been teaching for I don't even know how many years. So how many years has it been, do you think?
I have been in practice in Bangalore for almost 40 years now.
Yeah. So he's probably been teaching for at least as long, because you can see the comfort he has with the subject and the comfort which he teaches. This is just something that we hope all of you will get, and hopefully the MediMagic app will help you build the comfort and understanding of this. Now we do have some discounted prices for monthly and yearly plans, so we hope that you can all pick this up. Right? Anyway, thank you very much. I again want to thank you, sir, Dr. Tari, for joining us. It's been lovely having you. It's almost like I've got like an extra lecture from you again, and it's been quite wonderful to have that.
Thank you, Nikhil. Thank you very much for providing this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank your team also.
I hope you liked it. Please convey if you had any confusions or doubts at the end. I think there's one last doubt, sir. So what if the patient is found to have an aneurysm during CABG? Where does the atherosclerotic plaque? Yeah. Okay, Jayasuriya, this is a very confusing question, but I'm going to take it quite briefly.
No, I'll clarify it in a few seconds.
Yes, sir.
Aneurysm is a long-term complication of myocardial infarction.
Yeah.
The fibrous tissue which replaces the myocardium, if it is a thin layer of fibrous tissue, fibrous tissue is a very tough tissue.
Yes.
But if the layer of fibrous tissue which replaces the myocardium is very thin, then it will bulge out with each contraction of the heart and form an aneurysm. So it's a long-term complication. It doesn't occur immediately at the time of myocardial infarction.
Yes, and managing it is not something that we'll have to do in an acute situation.
It's a long-term complication. Probably that's a totally separate issue. It's not so much related to bypass surgery as it is related to bringing the myocardial functioning back to normal.
Correct. And sir, just to clarify, I think this is a very interesting question though. There can be an aneurysm of the heart itself during a myocardial infarction?
It's a complication of a myocardial infarction which occurs in late stages, maybe about 6 weeks, 8 weeks after the myocardial infarction.
All right. Now,
I would like to just
yes,
introduce the brief concept of what is called as a cardiac rehabilitation. Somebody asked the question, how do we know that the revascularization has been successful,
Yes.
So that is where the follow-up comes into play, that you follow up the patients regularly and do what are called as treadmill tests. The treadmill tests tell you whether on activity the patient's heart shows any signs of ischemia or not. And that is one important tool for rehabilitating this patient and finding out if your treatments have been successful or not.
Now, we do have a few more questions that came right at the end, sir.
Yeah, I'll be happy to answer that if you have time.
Yes, yeah, we will expand the time just for these. So the lifespan of a patient undergoing CABG increases by approximately how many years? Like, what is the efficacy? What is the advantage of CABG in the lifespan?
That is highly controversial, It is highly controversial subject because, it is found that patients who do not undergo CABG undergo through significant restrictions in their lifestyle, activities, and so on. Those who do not undergo, and many times they will continue to get anginal pain now and then, but they can live long with conservative management also, although the quality of life is not good. While patients who undergo CABG, they live equally long, but they may not be taking anything else except for aspirin. So the number of drugs which they consume is less. The activity levels which they can undertake is much higher. So basically, there is a difference in the quality of life. Patients who undergo CABG have better quality of life as compared to those who undergo medical management.
Right. So, Nikhil, I hope that answers your question. So, it's not about increasing lifespan so much as improving your quality of life and being like giving you the ability to perform more activities without experiencing severe angina, which many patients, after they get a heart attack, I mean, you can imagine you go into an emergency through angina. You're not, every time you get angina, you're going to try to limit your activity to prevent it from the fear of going bad. And that's a reason why many patients don't end up exercising, which is very, very good for their heart. They don't exercise because they're fear of the sensation of angina. Now, one last question, sir, from Pritham Haldar is that the changes in the levels of various kinds of troponin. I think some of the students are a little bit interested in how they would use that to differentiate between an acute MI and unstable angina, etc.
So, see, troponins are non-specific indicators of myocardial injury. They are not specific for myocardial infarction alone. So, you have to interpret the troponin levels in the context of a clinical picture. If a person comes with, let us say, chest pain and troponins are elevated, it indicates a myocardial infarction. But if patient comes with high fever and troponins are elevated, then it indicates inflammation of the myocardium, which is referred to as myocarditis. Other injuries to the myocardium can also occur if patients are having sepsis, they are having infections, endocarditis. All kinds of infection can also lead to elevation of troponin. So basically, troponins just represent myocardial injury. The processes which produce myocardial injuries may be different, and therefore troponins are to be interpreted in the light of the background clinical picture. A person presenting with chest pain, definitely the troponins will indicate that the injury is ischemic in nature.
Okay. And if it is ischemic in nature, what level of troponin is considered to be significant at about 3 hours, I believe, is what you had explained today?
See, I think anything above 5 is considered to be significant, Although people have different thresholds for monitoring it. Like, I told you that the elevation of troponin can occur anywhere between 4 to 6 hours after the myocardial infarction. So there is a time phase, So during this time phase, they will elevate, So at some time they will be normal, then slightly abnormal, then more abnormal as the time passes. But generally anything above 5 is considered to be definitive indicator of a myocardial injury. Although level of even 1.5 to 2 is also considered to be indicative that monitoring is needed.
Right. And if you do see a patient with a relatively low troponin count, I mean, you would consider monitoring this patient for any worsening or increase in troponin again and again. To just
that, like I told you, it is an indicator of myocardial necrosis. So if a patient has come for the first time with chest pain and the ECG is abnormal, but the enzyme troponins are normal, you may need monitoring.
Right.
If supposing over a period of 6 hours, the troponins remain normal, it indicates that the patient is having an unstable angina and he is admitted likewise and undergoes the same process of undergoing evaluation, angiography, and so on and so forth.
All right, sir. And there is one more questions, I'm afraid. One more student has asked, Prashanti has asked, will there be any significant increase in the ejection fraction and stroke volume after the procedures? Or is that likely that it will take some time before the heart is able to return to its normal state of pumping and function?
Definitely, you have to consider it this way that, say, for example, take into consideration that 40% of the myocardium is affected by the ischemic process. Consider that 40%, out of which 20% is salvageable, 20% is dead. Definitely, the cardiac output will improve if you salvage this 20% of the myocardium. So even though the patient may be showing a low ejection fraction at the time of diagnosis, but no symptoms of heart failure, attempt will be made to open up the artery, so that salvageable myocardium can improve the ejection fraction. Many patients who need treatment for heart failure in the first few days of myocardial infarction, until they become stable and can undergo a procedure, they may get out of their heart failure just because their ejection fraction improves over a period of time.
Yes. Yeah. So that's
presence of a low ejection fraction is another definitive indicator, that some form of revascularization should be done.
Right. So it is that basically if the ejection fraction is low, it is possible that revascularization can improve that.
Improve it, yes,
But
definitely.
in the sense that it will take some time for the myocardium to replace the muscular tissue that has been lost by the previous other muscle cells expanding in size and
No,
whatever.
Nikhil, that didn't happen. There is no expansion of the cells. There is just an improvement in the cardiac function. See, there is a process which we call as remodeling, in the
Yes.
myocardium. That
Yeah.
remodeling is what is harmful to the function of the heart. So
Yes.
many of the treatments are directed towards preventing this remodeling. Remodeling is what leads to the loss of contractile function of the heart. So many of the medical treatments like aldosterone, ACE inhibitors and all that thing, they prevent remodeling of the myocardium and thereby try to retain myocardial function. So there are many concepts in this particular field, which one needs to know before one can realize what is the rationale behind these treatments. So remodeling is one important concept now, which has got a long-term deleterious effects on the myocardial function. And many of the treatments, including a CABG, the angioplasty, is directed towards preventing this from happening.
Right. So remodeling is one of the biggest issues that prevents the heart from returning to normal function. And AC inhibitors and ARBs, I think, are some of the drugs that we use to prevent the remodeling. They have a very strong effect on prevention of remodeling, and so they help improve the function of the heart long term as well. Right, because the heart function could keep on decreasing, and this is something that prevents that.
Yeah.
And
Remodeling basically involves no malalignment of this myosin
yeah,
tropomyosin filaments. When they're malaligned, the contractility declines. So whatever treatment can prevent this malalignment of remaining myosin and tropomyosin filaments is what
yeah.
will retain the cardiac function.
Yes. All right. So I don't think we have any more questions, and I think we can just take a break and end the session. Thank you so much for coming, Dr.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all students for coming. Please join us on MediMagic, and we hope that we can conduct such webinars again in the future. Please let us know if you want any specific webinars, if you want anything with Dr. Tare. He's so enthusiastic, though I don't know if he wants to come back after such a long conversation.
Oh, I would love to come back. There is no problem with that.
That's great. That's great. And I just want to make sure that all of you know that you can anytime let us know if there's anything that you want to be, discussed in a more enterprising way. We can have more sessions for you and things that you feel are more important to you and things that you want to focus on for your exams. Thank you so much once again. Thank you again, Dr. Tare. I think I've thanked you like 7 times already, but I don't think it's ever enough because this explanation has been brilliant.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks
Bye.
a lot. Right. Bye, everyone. And thank you so much for coming.